I want to turn to some breaking news. Ottawa's $40 billion First Nations child welfare agreement could be in jeopardy. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal rejected the part of the deal designed to compensate kids and families harmed by the discriminatory on-reserve child welfare system. The tribunal says the legal settlement the government reached leaves some kids out and shortchanges others. So where does the agreement go from here? Patty Hajdu is Minister of Indigenous Services, and she's here in studio. Hi, Minister Hajdu. Thank you for making the time and for your patience over the last few minutes. I appreciate it.
Great to be here.
I wanted to start off and just ask you, because I listened to the press conference that you and your colleagues delivered after this decision came out, and Minister Lametti, the Minister of Justice, almost seemed to downplay the finality of it. Like, this is a summary decision, this isn't the last word. But when I read through the decision itself, the tribunal is pretty clear. We're giving you this stuff now so that you know what's coming down the pipe. All you're going to get later is a more full description of why we came to this conclusion. So why would your government be trying to downplay the finality of this?
I don't think that Minister Lametti was trying to downplay the finality of the decision of the CRHRT. I think what he was trying to convey is that we do want to know the details behind the decision, and we do want to understand how the tribunal got to that decision, particularly in light of the fact that the CRHRT acknowledged at the top end this is indeed a historic settlement. This is indeed operating through the lens of true collaboration with First Nations partners. But obviously, the tribunal feels there's still a distance to go, and we want to understand that fully. I, in my remarks, was very clear to First Nations people and First Nations partners that this is not the end of the road. This is a stumbling block in my mind, but we will compensate children who have been removed.
So my main takeaway from what I read in the decision was basically that the settlement that your government has reached, which you're right, was acknowledged is historic and is broad, isn't broad enough. So it doesn't fall in line completely with what the tribunal has said about who can qualify for the compensation it decided was earned and was necessary. Which to me I read as there's some people who will not be covered by the settlement that your government has arrived at. Do you admit that that's the case?
Well, that's certainly the perspective of the tribunal. I think, at least that's my interpretation with the support that I have from the legal analysis on my team. But I will say this. I think it is disappointing through the lens of truly trying to honor not just the tribunal, but the perspective of the government, that these kinds of settlements are best done through the lens of Indigenous leadership and Indigenous-led processes. Having said that, obviously, we are fully intent on compensating children who've been removed from care through a discriminatory child welfare process. And we've been really clear about that. I think the next step is to truly understand how we address what the tribunal is considering as a missing class of children that in their mind this agreement doesn't cover, and to work with partners as we did before to get to a solution that First Nations leaders are comfortable with in terms of how to deliver that compensation.
So let me be blunt then. If there is a group of kids who are not covered by the settlement, and you agree that the tribunal has highlighted that, is there money, and will there be money, to compensate those kids?
Well, I think what we've said all along is that we're going to get this job done. We're going to compensate kids, and we are going to reform that child welfare system. We don't forget the second part of this work, the $20 billion dedicated to system reform, equally important. So my message today to First Nations people is we're going to stay at this work with First Nations partners till we get the job done. What does that look like? That's the analysis that we're undergoing right now. What does it mean? And you know, who are these children that, and how do we identify this class of children that aren't covered by the agreement that we put forward to the tribunal?
I guess I would respectfully challenge, and the reason why I'm asking that so bluntly is because I take your point that obviously your government has gone far in this settlement. But prior to arriving at the settlement, there were a lot of disappointed people when your government tried to set aside the decision basically by the tribunal that you challenged. You appealed the decision by the tribunal initially. And I know there was intent there and a sort of a vocalization of an intent to actually make sure people get compensated. But the message that was delivered at the time was, let's put the brakes on this because we actually think the scope is too broad and we're worried about the precedent that it would set. So there has been some mixed messages from your government government on this. And when you say you're going to consider what the tribunal has decided, my question is, if in fact there are kids who should, according to the tribunal, be awarded or compensated for what they have endured, or their family members or whomever, is your government willing to go above and beyond $20 billion if that's what it costs?
What I'm saying right now is that we're willing to work with First Nations partners to make sure that children aren't left behind. And I will again reiterate, this was an intentional collaboration with First Nations leaders and partners. In fact, not just the AFN, but other partners, other parties to the negotiation, to put the design and the compensation regime in front of them to ensure that it was Indigenous-led and that it met the mark from the perspective of First Nations people. So we've got to continue that work. That's what the decision today says to me, that there's more work ahead. And my commitment to First Nations people is we're going to stay there and we're going to stay the course.
And certainly I'm not trying to take away from the Indigenous leadership that was involved in making this decision. My understanding is it's not necessarily entirely representative of every Indigenous voice, right? And when you say, I take your point on no child being left behind, but there is nothing that has stopped your government from starting to pay compensation since the decision came down, actually, from the tribunal. Your government chose the route of the lawsuit or the settlement and to work with the AFN, yes, and there has been a conclusion reached there. But in the meantime, your government could have already been ensuring that no child is left behind by paying out that compensation to people you know and have agreed to are entitled to it.
Well, I think the compensation is one piece, and I think it was really important to us. It was really important to the parties that the process was Indigenous-led. Don't forget, previous compensation regimes have, though well-deserved, have ended up in unintentional consequences when not designed and led through First Nations perspectives and First Nations leadership. So I think that work, being First Nations led, is critically important. What I also think, though, is that the other piece of work that is still ongoing, which is about reforming child welfare, which is about reforming a system of care that was systematically discriminatory, that was not Indigenous designed or led in any way, and that ties into that transformational work of C92 needs to continue so that we can see an end to this kind of discrimination and the end to the suffering that families have been facing.
And I would never take away from those efforts, and certainly $20 billion is important, and that part of this is important. But my questions are specifically around how far your government is willing to go on the other side of it, and that does involve compensation. A, why haven't you already started compensating people who deserve it? For years, the tribunal has said they do. And B, you haven't directly, with respect, answered whether or not your government is willing to go beyond $20 billion if, in fact, more kids are entitled to that compensation than you originally estimated.
I think I've been clear that
you said no child will be left behind, but that's not an answer about money.
Well, what I can say is that we're willing to stick with it to make sure that children are compensated fairly. And so, again, we're going to review the details behind the summary decision today, and we'll have a better sense of what that will take after that review is complete.
And when would it be complete? Do you have an estimate on the time?
I know that all parties are working to understand what this means, First Nations parties as well as the government, so that we can do this work quickly together.
I ask only, and I'm not trying to be annoying about the time, I ask just because of the question of compensation, right? Like, the longer it takes to understand who qualifies, or from your perspective, who is entitled to it, the longer it takes to deliver that money. Do you think, for example, by the end of the year, that review will be complete?
Well, I can't give you a date because I don't have a sense of how long it's going to take, but I will say that we're working urgently on it.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Minister Hajdu, thank you very much for coming in. I appreciate your time as always.
Thank you very much, Vashi.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.